Greetings, and welcome to another episode of Pep Talks Uncut. Today is Sunday, March 13th, 2022. If you hadn't already changed your clocks ahead 1 hour, you probably should. What's wrong? There we go. So Pep Talks Uncut is a 30-minute show. It is unscripted and unedited. Whatever glitches or other incidental things happen during the program, we just roll with the punches and keep going. Now, a few months ago, during our first season, we invited Dylan Altemara to come onto our show to explain things that he's doing for his candidacy for his particular district, House district, in Pennsylvania. And we're back with him again today because thanks to redistricting, there's been some changes, and he'd like to bring us up to speed on those. So Dylan,
thank you so much for having me back, David. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. So first of all, let's recap where we left off last time. So we were talking about a variety of topics, including taxation and public roads, the interstate toll system running through the southern part of Pennsylvania, among other topics. Discrimination also came up as a topic, and as did conversion therapy and so forth. But today you have news you're bringing us. So
right.
What's
so
up?
I wanted to go ahead and share with everybody that because of redistricting, unfortunately, the district in which I'm located has been pretty much, for all intents and purposes, wiped off the map. So we have been consolidated with other neighboring districts. My part of Fayette County is in a district primarily centered in the Perryopolis area. So unfortunately, as a result of the ground game and the way the new district is structured, I will no longer be a candidate for the state legislature in the 22 cycle. But nevertheless, I think there are still a number of issues and topics which relate not only to the folks in my community, but throughout Pennsylvania that I would still very much like to discuss with you about, because I think ultimately, unfortunately, as Democrats, we've, through inaction, have caused ourselves to be in the minority so badly here. We don't really have representation explaining and talking about the issues in a way that can lead to future success for candidates, not just in this cycle, but in future cycles.
So you're saying your candidacy has ended because of redistricting? Is that what we're hearing?
That's correct, yes.
Ouch, that really hurts, because we were counting on our voice being heard in Harrisburg from your part of Pennsylvania. In particular, and mind you, that's not an endorsement, if you will. That is simply saying that you have definitely demonstrated in our previous two episodes in which you were on, you've demonstrated your concern and sense of caring for the LGBTQ plus community. So what are some of the issues then that you think Democrats should be focusing on? And in fairness, we will get to the Republican Party a little later in our season.
Certainly. So I think to answer your question, it really does come back to those simple kitchen table issues. And obviously at the federal level, there's been a great deal of difficulty getting Mr. Biden's agenda passed. Two corporate Democrats in particular that, let's be honest, are on the take. And because of that, exchanging of money simply refused to do the bare minimum to help the majority of Americans on issues that there's wide bipartisan support for. But that should not change the fact that at least locally and at the state level, there's a great deal that still can be done specific to the minimum wage, specific to ensuring that abortion care is something that folks have access to. Also protecting, of course, minority rights, and moving forward, ensuring that just the overall economic system, which has really become so entrenched as a result of regressive taxation, is appropriately addressed, so that, if you will, the pain is spread out more evenly and not just disproportionately placed on the backs of working poor people and working middle class people.
Now that my phone is, so that was pretty fascinating stuff. You are concerned about the minimum wage. What do you think it should be?
Well, it's interesting because as a result of inflation currently, I think we can all say for certain that 725 is unacceptable. Going just on the existing metrics before this current streak of inflation, it was very clear that 1968 was the last time that it was equal to both inflation and productivity. So had it kept pace with inflation since 68, today the metrics say it should be 12 and change or excuse me, 12 and change an hour. Had it kept pace with productivity since then, the metrics say it should be a roughly $24 an hour. Now, I think in light of our current inflationary trends, $15 an hour makes sense.
It seems to me that if we are capable of offering as much as a 5.9% adjustment, which was called the cost of living adjustment or COLA, for Social Security disability and SSI and Social Security generally, it seems that if we're capable of making those payments, we should very easily be able to afford an increase in the minimum wage. Do you support the idea that perhaps the government in some way could supplement the minimum wage by, say, tax incentives to companies so that they would increase their minimum, that the law would go up, and that companies would not be as harshly impacted by the increase?
David, I think that's a great
Or do you have
question. Let me just say, the main reason why the minimum wage currently is so low is largely because the business community, the Chamber of Commerce, big business, and employers everywhere for years now have made it their primary concern to buy off Republicans, and yes, some corporate Democrats too, to keep folks' wages artificially low. That's precisely why we have so much income inequality. Basically, every hour of work that most workers in this Commonwealth and throughout this nation are doing amounts to a certain degree of wage theft because the value that they're adding is not being shared fairly with them. And so because of that, unfortunately, regressive policy, that's why our minimum is so low. But as you had said, certainly I think there are a number of things that can be done through the tax code to backstop and incentivize specifically small businesses so that they're in a position to be able to afford to pay a living wage. I am sensitive to the fact that there are small mom and pop businesses that operate on thin margins, but that shouldn't be an excuse for us to allow them to pay starvation wages, particularly when over 70% of the very largest corporations in Pennsylvania are currently paying zero.
It seems to me that what you're reminiscent of is Franklin Roosevelt saying that any business that relies on paying its employees starvation wages shouldn't be in business in the first place.
Exactly.
And he raised that point rather poignantly during a fireside chat in 1935. At the time, they were beginning to implement the minimum wage. Now, a considerable amount of time has passed since 1935, and employees have generally had to fight to get minimum wage increases. I recall going from $3.35 an hour to $4.25 an hour in the 1980s was quite a struggle. Getting us up to $7.25, where we're currently at, it seems to me that attract business to increase the minimum wage in Pennsylvania, largely because our neighboring states have raised their minimum wages. Even West Virginia.
Certainly, David, to your point, when you pay starvation wages as an employer, you shouldn't be surprised when people say thanks, but no thanks. And also, I would just say that, there's a lot of talk out there using McDonald's example. If you pay people a living wage, the price of a hamburger might go up a little bit. And that's true. But at the same time, maybe the quality of service would improve because you could actually attract people who could actually work that job and perform the duties of that job, but actually receive compensation in return for them to survive. I think sometimes when you look at what our current minimum wage structure attracts as far as talent, maybe that's one of the reasons why I should say customer service seems to have died, because there's really not much empathy or respect for the customer when the money that they're paying the employee's employer isn't being shared equally amongst all of the concerned parties.
There's a gentleman by the name of Dan Price. Now, Dan started a company several years ago And when he did, he came in with a fairly healthy investment to be able, he used his own money to be able to get this company going. And he hired a number of employees to work in his factory, his assembly plant. And he had a number of secretarial staff as well. And he decided that rather than paying everyone the minimum wage, he would take his salary and bring it all the way down to $70,000 a year, when the average CEO is making $500,000 or more. He dropped his salary all the way down to 70, but in doing so, he then spread out the money that would have gone to him to all of his employees. So minimum wage in that plant is $70,000 a year. What do you think of a concept like that? Is that something that could be replicated elsewhere?
Well, certainly, I think that's a really inspirational business model that he was able to achieve in his place of business. Now, not knowing what type of capital he was able to bring to the table, let's be clear, that might not be feasible for a lot of the small businesses in existence. Maybe for businesses that are on a comparable scale to his, that's something they should consider. But regardless of what the internal pay structure looks like, I think we can both agree that at least the floor can be raised from where it is now, because where it is now is really an artificially low place. Once you have a livable medium, minimal standard, then from there, if a workplace wants to make the minimum wage amongst all their employees 70,000 or 50,000 or even 100,000, and they have the economic capacity to do so, great, God bless them. But I just think that imposing such a number and thinking that that could be replicated in all businesses obviously isn't necessarily something that can be easily photocopied. But I think it is something that businesses in a similar position as the one you referenced should certainly consider, because I think ultimately it's the employees that are putting money in his pocket. And I'm sure as his business grows, ultimately his salary will go up from 70,000 as well as theirs.
Precisely, and that was an arrangement they made within the company internally. And I should point out that $70,000 isn't just some arbitrary number. He divided the excess that he was earning across all of his employees. So the point of this is that, the point he was making is that the salaries that CEOs receive and CFOs and COOs, the value that they provide the company is significantly overfunded, and the value that the employees on the shop floor or along the assembly line provide is significantly underpaid. Now, one of the things that Dan Price has done is he's also given high praise to union labor. What do you think about union labor in this country and the condition that it's in?
Well, I think candidly, the truth of the matter is the level of union participation is at an all-time low. And that is obviously apparent when you look at not just the pay metrics, but just how far we are behind in terms of a variety of other just basic job security and health and welfare provisions. I think, it's worth noting that in many parts of Scandinavia, there's not necessarily widespread governmental action on a minimum wage. In fact, in many of those countries, there's not even a minimum wage, and that's because upwards of 80 to 90% of the workforce is unionized. So here, we've just left people out to dry either way. We don't have a strong enough union movement to protect people on the job in a collective manner with their coworkers. But then conversely, the government at all levels has been captured by industry to where we're incapable of passing even the most bare minimum protections to help them in that arena as well. So I'm all for expanding union rights. I think, we were told Mr. Biden was a, quote, most pro-union president there ever will be, yet to my knowledge, the pro-act in Congress pretty much DOA. So I think that's something that the Democrats should really focus on heading into the midterm. And I think also it's something that should be replicated at the state level, because while I don't think it's the government's business to interfere between a worker and an employer and say there needs to be a union here, certainly if it's an arrangement that the employees are comfortable with creating, they should be able to do so without interference or reprisal.
Okay, let's change topics for a bit. We'll move away from economics and something more near and dear to my heart, which is education. And the particular pertinent point I'd like to share is that a number of school districts across Pennsylvania have decided to drop their mask mandates against COVID-19 and their social distancing policies. Do you think this was a wise move at this time, or should school districts have been a little bit more prudent?
Well, it's really interesting because I think there's a number of variables that have to be taken into consideration. Currently, it seems as if we're on the downward trajectory as far as COVID cases are concerned. So I think that should signal in an easing of restriction. But at the same time, to your point, a month ago, 60 days ago, when we were really in the middle of a sharp escalation, a lot of right-wing school boards that were elected this past cycle went ahead and just gave a giant middle finger to science to pursue political brownie points. And do I think it was to the detriment of students? Absolutely. I don't think it's very difficult to say as an elected school board member, or frankly as an administrator, hey, if we get at least these many students in our buildings vaccinated, we can ease some restrictions. But until we hit that number, there are just certain common sense safeguards that need to be implemented to ensure we don't continue to spread a very communicable disease that most recently in its current iteration is much more damaging to kids than previous variants.
Okay, now in terms of education, away from COVID-19, let's talk for a moment about curriculum. One of the curricular issues that has been spreading like wildfire across not just Pennsylvania, but across the country, is this belief that CRT, or critical race theory, is something that shouldn't be addressed in grades K through 12.
Well, let's just call critical race theory in K-12 schools what it is, and that is a manufactured cultural war issue used by Republicans and Republican operatives to turn the public against teachers and school districts so that they can then steal our tax dollars and give that money to the operators of charter schools and cyber charter schools who just so happen to donate millions of dollars a year to their campaigns at every level of the government. This has nothing to do with educating kids, with making sure the school environment is safe and inclusive. This has to do with misinformation, creating a lie, which, as we all know, the Republicans aren't beyond doing, to simply turn public opinion against an institution that has long been at the center of the community so they can steal our money and give it to their corporate donors.
So, as I understand it, critical race theory is not something that can be taught in K through 12, largely because what it is at its core is a legal theory in which there are inherent parts of our judicial and legal system that were designed at a time in which racism was running rampant in this country. Not that it isn't now, but it was far worse then. And that a number of laws and a number of ways of conducting business were incorporated into day-to-day life. For example, redlining neighborhoods. So banks and real estate companies would decide where people who were of color could reasonably assume they would be able to get a mortgage, and other neighborhoods they could reasonably assume would never get a mortgage. And that kind of redlining led Opportunity Commission and other agencies run through housing and urban development that make sure that lending and borrowing for home purchases is run without consideration of race. And I don't understand how that could possibly be taught to students in grades K through 12 who are just learning how to balance a checkbook, let alone purchase real estate.
Well, I agree with your sentiments there, but as you know, David, today in Republican politics, nothing needs to make sense. It's just, one culture war issue after another. But unfortunately, they find a great deal of success. And that's primarily because I think many Democrats who, let's be honest, share the same donors are afraid to call out the underlying motivations of the nonsense.
Speaking of education still, one of the other concerns that exists across Pennsylvania is the belief that transgender students are somehow creeping into sports teams that align with their gender identity rather than their sex at birth.
Mm.
And as a result, not only in Pennsylvania, but in other states, there has been a movement to restrict participation in interscholastic events and athletic events in particular, to limit that specifically to your sex at birth, rather across other matters such as locker room facilities and bathroom facilities. Do you come down, where do you come down on that particular issue? Are the districts doing a good job with that, or is that just totally bogus?
Listen, I think it's just yet another manifestation of our country's long history of discriminating against the other. For a long time in this country, it was blacks. About 15 years ago, when George Bush was running the second time around, they were doing ballot initiative after ballot initiative after ballot initiative to go after gay marriage. But unfortunately for them, just like the white community was exposed to more and more black people and regular Americans were exposed to more and more gay Americans, I think it's only a matter of time before more people can say in their lives, they know a transgender person and the thought of such a person existing doesn't offend them. Because that's really where these positions come from. It comes from a place of these individuals are offended by the existence of another person. It has nothing to do with them somehow compromising the competitive integrity of sports or endangering other kids by sharing a locker room or a dressing room. It's simple and outright blatant discrimination against a group that a small majority of sycophants just doesn't like, and wish if they could, they can close their eyes and make them go away.
Okay, well, that brings us to our last topic of the day, and that has to do with what's going on in Florida. Now, in Florida, there is a bill, and hopefully other states don't find themselves drifting toward it, but there's a bill that's moving its way through the House here in Florida and is on its way to the Senate and will eventually land on Governor DeSantis's desk, and that is that you are not allowed to talk about sexual orientation or gender identity in grades K through 12, and it would simultaneously ban groups that are gender sexuality alliances or gay straight alliances. Now, to me, this seems like blatant discrimination, way out of hand, and that Land Illegal or the ACLU or some other legal entity will jump into this and find their way to federal court. What do you think Pennsylvania's prospects are with the bill?
Well, I think
like
it really
this?
ultimately comes down to what happens in November. I think there's no question where the right wingers stand on LGBTQ plus issues. And frankly, I think it's abhorrent when you have members of the community who continue to embrace their captor. Let's be clear, there is not one right-wing politician out there who supports you, who acknowledges you, or frankly, who didn't wish you weren't in existence. I think they've made their policy positions quite clear as it relates to members of the community. And ultimately, I think it's important that Pennsylvanians look at what's going on in Florida, because unless you want a big government to basically erase you from the conversation, then you really need to weigh who you vote for in the upcoming election, because I have no question in my mind whatsoever that given the chance, the right-wingers in Harrisburg would try to implement the exact same law, or maybe even a law worse than that, similar to what you're seeing in Texas, where currently, if you're a transgender youth, it's incumbent now upon the doctor, the teacher, or any other licensed professional in your life to report your parent for alleged child abuse.
Well, we are going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, as we've run out of time for today's episode. But I'd like to thank Dylan Altemara for being on the show today. I would also like to thank our host studio, away from our home studio, for allowing us to have a chance to record this episode and to be able to share it with our supporters at Pennsylvania Equality Project. Now, I should point out that the Florida Social Justice Project was pretty interested in hearing that response to that last question, because I think as conservatives go, Florida and other states with conservative legislatures are trying to bind together in ways that are unprecedented. And I think you were spot on when it comes to, it's going to take voters in November to weigh in and give us their thoughts. But again, that brings us to the close of our show.
Thank you
So
once again
Dylan,
for
thank
having
you
me.
for
I
being here.
appreciate it.
And for everybody tuning in, don't forget, you should have set your clocks forward 1 hour today. If you haven't, please do. And stay tuned for next week's episode of Pep Talks Uncut, when we have yet another special guest.